Boys and girls, you are in for a treat today. What you're going to hear is truly a national treasure and a community treasure embodied in a person and his story. I want you to think that and remember that all of history, every day, you are part of it. Everything that happens around the world, everything that happens in our country, everything that happens in our state and in our community and in our school is part of building history. And as people live through history, every now and then some major event literally lands on their front doorstep. And that's the case with our guest speaker today. A major event landed right on his physical doorstep.
Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my father was a naval officer. He graduated from the Naval Academy, served on surface vessels in World War I. After that war was over, he went to flight school in Pensacola, was involved in developing naval aviation, flying off the first carrier in the 30s. He had a wonderful career, including 3 years in Paris in the late 30s before World War II started as a naval attaché to the American Embassy, and I lived there. At that time, I spoke fluent French because I didn't have any option. Nobody spoke English. Of course, I've forgotten most of that. And then we moved back to the States in 1940. We went to California. He was executive officer of a carrier, and then he got assigned to Ford Island as the commanding officer of this naval air station. And we went out there in I guess it was late 1940, and it was a wonderful life. I went to a school called Punahou School that had been started by the missionaries to integrate them with Hawaiian children, and they had a great rule. If you were in the lower school, which meant up to the 7th grade, you weren't allowed to wear shoes to school unless there was something wrong with your feet. So we went to school every day barefooted in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and that was just very free. Then as you got up to the 8th grade, you had to start wearing shoes, but I didn't make it that far. So I had it was an idyllic existence for a child. We lived here on Ford Island, which is in the middle of Pearl Harbor, which has a very narrow entrance down here out of the Pacific. And there was a ferry that went from Ford Island over to what we call the main base. And we would take that every day. Somebody drive us to school, bring us home at night. And my brother and I, he was 13, I was 9, just had a wonderful life there. There was a little swimming pool, a little tennis court. We were free to roam around. We built a little, I don't know what you call it, a little boat with outriggers, and we would paddle around and visit these ships, and they'd ask us to come out and take a look. So it was a good life. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, how many of you have heard of that day? Show me by hands. Well, that's good. That's terrific. On that morning, we were in our quarters. My brother and I lived in one of the wings of that house. It was our custom on Sunday morning to get the paper and read the funny papers while my mother and dad slept in, or my father went to play golf. As we were reading the funny papers, we heard all these explosions. So we went outside, and my brother looked up and said, "Those are Jap planes." And you could just see them. They were flying over, headed for the ships. And we went back in the house and went to my father's room. He was already up, talking on the phone. And he told my mother, my brother and I had a 6-month-old baby sister, that this was an air raid and for us to go to our bomb shelter. Well, we knew about that because it was a very small area that we lived in this area here. And the bomb shelter was an old reinforced concrete gun emplacement that had been put there when we occupied Pearl Harbor in the late 1920s. And it was, the Admiral's house was built on top of this reinforced concrete gun emplacement, and that was our designated bomb shelter. It would have withstood probably not a big bomb, but a small one. So my mother said to us, "You boys go to the bomb shelter, and I'll bring your sister." She was a babe in arms. So we kind of went from house to house, made our way to the bomb shelter. My mother came later. While she was on the way there, a Japanese backseat gunner strafed her, she and my sister, and he missed. But he came pretty close, and for the rest of her life, my mother never forgave the Japanese. My father and the rest of us, kind of got over it, but till the day she died, she would have nothing to do with anybody who was Japanese because of that incident. So we went into the bomb shelter, and all of the families came in there. It was pretty good sized. Had some slits and 2 openings, and my brother and I kept trying to sneak out and see what was going on. You know, it's funny, at 9, I wasn't smart enough to be scared. I was more interested than frightened. Probably should have been more frightened than interested, but that's the way it was. So we kept trying to sneak out of the bomb shelter to get a better look at what was going on. But we had no sooner gone in the shelter than the Arizona, which was this ship right here, took a direct hit. A bomb dropped from an overhead bomber, went straight through into one of its magazines, which is where all the ammunition is stored, and the ship exploded. Just literally exploded. And some 1,200 men on the Arizona were killed out of a total of about 2,500 who lost their lives in the whole raid. So the Arizona was the worst catastrophe of that raid. And actually part of the funnel of the Arizona came through the roof of our house when it blew up, went right through my father's bed, but he wasn't in it, he was already gone. And it was just a horrific explosion. So the raid went on for, the first wave was there about an hour. There was about a 30-minute interval. The second wave came in. There were the Japanese had 6 aircraft carriers in their fleet. 6 aircraft carriers were all that the United States had in its entire Navy at that time. But they had 6 carriers in this attack group, and they carried some 300 airplanes, which came over Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. They were very well-trained pilots. They concentrated on military targets. Very few, if any, non-military people got hurt. They never bombed Honolulu in spite of what some of the reports were. The only thing that ever hit Honolulu was some Army anti-aircraft shell that didn't explode and came back down and went off. So during the course of the raid, we all sat there, and the thing that really we couldn't understand was there was not a single American airplane over this entire harbor, the whole raid. And we knew that right about 4 or 5 miles away was Hickam Field, which had a ton of P-40s, which was the fighter plane of that day. I say a ton, 2 or 3 squadrons of them. And not a single one ever got up off the ground. And what happened was kind of another Pearl Harbor mess up. They had, the people, the commanding officers, like my father, had been told to take the aircraft, line them up wing to wing, because they had some idea that the Japanese were on the move in the Pacific, and they were worried about sabotage. Honolulu in those days was about 40% Japanese Americans, first or second generation. which they were called Niseis and Sanseis, and they were such an integral part of the community that it wouldn't have worked without them. But nobody knew exactly where their loyalty lay. So they lined all these planes up to prevent sabotage in case something happened in the far Pacific. No one had any idea they'd get this far. And so when the Japanese attacked, these planes were all lined up beautifully for them, and they just flew down the row and shot them up. And the P-40s at Wheeler Field, not a single one got off the ground. They all got shot up on the ground. So there was no air defense at all. By the time the second wave came in, all these ships were manned, had the anti-aircraft batteries up and firing, and I guess the Japanese lost maybe 20 or 25 planes out of 300 in this whole raid. The destruction they did in Pearl Harbor was just catastrophic. But these red ships are ships that were sunk, went to the bottom of. These were all right across from near our house. We used to use this pier to take our little Tin Lizzie out and paddle around the harbor. But this was the Nevada, and it was sunk and turned upside down. Of course, the Arizona, which I've mentioned, exploded and went to the bottom. West Virginia sank to the bottom, upright. Fortunately, it didn't go keel up. The Oklahoma went keel up. And actually, for several days after December the 7th, there were men in the Oklahoma who had gotten, although it was capsized, bottom up, had gotten themselves, and they were tapping on the hull of the ship to give people notice that they were there. And they tried like the devil to get through to them. But the hulls of those battleships were so thick, they just couldn't get through to them, so they never rescued anybody. In fact, no one ever got rescued from a ship that went down. The ones that saved themselves jumped off and swam ashore. There were fires everywhere. Most of these ships were burning to one extent or another. All of these planes down here were on fire. The airfield over here had been shot up. A couple of the hangars were burning. But our officers' quarters area, except for the big hole in the roof of my house, looked just like they had before the raid started. So, but there were a lot of fires all over. Just smoke was everywhere. One of the interesting sidelights is this ship, the Neosho, which was an oiler, if you like. But this one was filled with high-octane aviation gas for Ford Island. My father said that he spent his time down here where the patrol planes were, trying to save some of them. They were all out in the open. Fortunately, the Navy's carriers, of which there were 3 assigned to Pearl Harbor, were all at sea. Had the Japanese gotten our carriers that day, the war would have been prolonged probably another year, because it took us about 1.5 years to get cranked up and build new ships. But they were all at sea, so anyway, the Neosho was parked here full of aviation gas, and my father went up to the guy in charge. He said, "Take that ship and move it across on the other side of the bay." So the Neosho took off and came across and hid way back in here, where if it blew up, it wouldn't do any damage. But it would have been catastrophic for that ship to explode with all that aviation gas on board. The Japanese made 2 big mistakes. This area over here were all submarines. And we had a good submarine fleet. The Japanese failed to, 1, attack the submarines, which was the only thing we had that was capable of going on the offensive after this disaster. And they failed to attack the oil tank farm which was down here. And keeping in mind that Hawaii's 2,300 miles from the west coast, if they destroyed this tank farm, there just wouldn't have been any fuel oil for our ships for quite a while till they could be rebuilt and replenished. So that was a big mistake on their part. Another thing about those days is that the ships, the oil that the ships used, burned on the surface. Shortly after the war, it didn't work that way anymore. So all these ships that leaked oil, the oil caught fire, and these poor sailors who were swimming to Ford Island had to swim through burning oil, and got severely burned. A lot of them ended up in our shelter because they didn't know where else to go. And that was really the worst part of it, was these burned men, literally with their skin peeling off, and we didn't have anything to do to help them. The women did what they could, but they didn't have anything. Finally, I guess maybe an hour into the raid, my father sent a Navy corpsman and some medical supplies down, and they did what they could for these people. Actually, our house ended up being a kind of an auxiliary hospital, and these injured men went in there, and we never got back in it again. So at the end of the second raid, we kind of were waiting to see what happened next, still in the bomb shelter. And around the middle of about 11 or 12 o'clock, incidentally, I failed to mention this started at about 10 minutes of 8 in the morning. Around 12 o'clock, the raids were all over. My father came down to see how we were doing. He had on a helmet and was carrying a submachine gun, and he was ready for war. And he had gotten slightly wounded. He got hit in the leg with a piece of shrapnel, so his leg was wrapped up, and he always referred to that as a very cheap Purple Heart that he got in the first hour of the war. And fortunately, he never got any more, but he did get that early one. And he came to see how the family was doing. Everybody was fine except our dachshund, and he said, "I believe Fritzy is shell-shocked." And this dog all the explosions it couldn't take it, and it was acting kind of nuts. The rest of the family was fine. So he said, "You all stay here, and I'm going to get somebody to drive you over to the mainland." And when I say mainland, I mean not Ford Island, Pearl Harbor being attached to the rest of Honolulu. And so we left in the late afternoon, and in those days you took a ferry back and forth. The ferry was just shot to hell. I mean, the top part of it looked terrible, but it floated fine. And we got on that ferry and came across to the ferry landing over here and went into Honolulu and stayed with friends of my family. Just a couple of comments about the circumstances. We had no idea that the Japanese had 6 aircraft carriers in a fleet that they could go all the way across the Pacific and attack us with. The thinking was that the Japanese were going to attack south with 2 or 3 aircraft carriers. We just didn't know. We didn't have good intelligence. And they managed to come from the northwest of Hawaii, mostly in squalls. And one of the great derelictions of duty that day was the admiral in whose bomb shelter I've stayed, who did not have his search planes, which were called PBYs, out patrolling that area. He thought, nobody's going to come from that part of the ocean, so we won't patrol it. Well, that's exactly where they were. So he had planes patrolling the other 3 quadrants, but not the northwest. Nobody ever saw the Japanese till they appeared over Pearl Harbor. There were a couple of they had these rather crude listening devices, and there were a couple of men who heard all this strange noise, but nobody paid any attention to them. They also had a crude radar on the far corner of the island, pointing in the directions from which the Japanese came. These two men saw this tremendous number of airplanes on their radar, and they reported it in to the officer on duty. He said, not to worry, we're expecting some B-17s. And these enlisted men said, this is not 3 or 4 B-17s, this is a huge number of airplanes headed our way. He said, no, don't worry about it. So nothing was done. Another opportunity missed was there was a destroyer, USS Ward, which was patrolling just outside of the entrance to the harbor. And it saw a submarine periscope, attacked it. It was one of the Japanese midget submarines. They launched 4 of them. 2 of them got into the harbor. The Ward sank one, and one of them washed up on the beach somewhere. But they attacked this submarine. They sank it. They reported to the Pacific Fleet headquarters that they'd done that. Nobody paid any attention. They just did not react to it. The admiral in charge was a man named Kimmel, who got canned after this. But he paid no attention to this report from the Ward. So that was another missed opportunity. There were 3 or 4 Army P-40s at a remote place on the island of Oahu, which is where Honolulu is, that got up off the ground and scrambled, mixed it up with the Japanese and shot a couple down, but that was a long way from Pearl Harbor. Now this chart shows you where all these ships were by name. These were all destroyers up here, with these big ships were called destroyer tenders. And there was a couple of cruisers, and this was Battleship Row is what it was known as, because they were just all in a row right here. The Japanese attacked the outboard battleships with torpedoes very effectively. The inboard ones, including the Arizona, they had to attack with bombs, which they did very effectively. They had dive bombers, and they also had bombers that dropped bombs straight down. Every one of them got hit. The ones in red were sunk. The ones in yellow were, the ones in orange were heavily damaged. And the ones in yellow were less damaged. Many of these ships were salvaged and ended up getting back into the war. They were so old that they were used for naval gunfire support when the Marines landed. They didn't try and they couldn't travel fast enough to keep up with the fast carriers we built, which could easily go 25 knots indefinitely. These old battleships could do about 12. So they got back into the war, but mostly as gunfire ships. There are a few ironies about all this. As I mentioned, the Japanese strike force had 6 aircraft carriers. In the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, which was really the turning point in the Pacific War, we sank 4 of those same 6 carriers during the course of that battle with our own aircraft from carriers. And that was really the turning point. The Japanese were not able to ever replace them. So their strike force was severely diminished. And Midway was their last offense against American. They attacked Midway Island. I wonder how many of you ever heard this, that they landed in Alaska and occupied, that was U.S. soil. They occupied one of the remote islands up there where there was later a big fight to get rid of them, but they got rid of them. And that was kind of a turning point for the Japanese as far as being offensive was concerned. Their admiral was a man named Yamamoto, who had gone to Harvard and studied. He was the Japanese naval attaché in Washington for 2 or 3 years, spoke fluent English, understood the American economy, and after this raid, he commented that, "I'm afraid we've let a tiger out of its cage and we'll never get it back in." And he was right, because our industrial capacity was such that by 1945, the United States had 12 million people in its military. Starting from before Pearl Harbor, there were a few 100,000 in the military total. And 4 years later, there were 12 million. Think about that. That's a short period of time. We had 25 what they call fleet carriers, big, fast carriers that each carried about 80 aircraft. And we were roaming the Pacific, and at that point, the Japanese were purely on the defense. And my father was commander of one of those aircraft carriers. So he had his chance to get back at him for Pearl Harbor, which he did with great glee, I should say. It was interesting. He was never really bitter about any of this. He viewed the war in the Pacific as kind of the culmination of what he'd been working on for the prior 20 years, and he was happy to have a fight with him. When this was over, we went into town and stayed with some friends who lived on the beach at Diamond Head, which is a landmark at one end of Waikiki in Honolulu, beautiful area. And my brother at my school, Punahou School, which incidentally is the school that President Obama attended when he lived in Hawaii, my brother and I, we didn't see much of my father, but my brother and mother and sister stayed with these friends who lived right on the beach. And the Army was busy putting in machine gun emplacements, and they didn't have much in the way of artillery, but they were fortifying the beach because no one knew whether the Japanese were going to try and land or not, because they'd done so much damage that, it would have been not too hard for them to make a landing. So the beach was being littered with machine gun nests, some small artillery. So every day my brother and I went down and played with those soldiers. And we had a good time. They were good to us. They let us handle their machine guns. The school was closed. Punahou School was closed starting the Monday after the raid, and didn't open again for about, I think it was the end of the war. I'm not sure because I was gone. But anyway, the school closed, so we didn't have any school to go to, which we really liked, from December until we came back to the States in early March. When we came back to the States, we were in a convoy of ships that had been out to Australia and taken some troops out there and were on their way back to the States. So the conditions were very Spartan. But the hardest part for us was we didn't have any warm clothes. We'd been living out in Hawaii for 2 years. We had shorts and t-shirts and maybe one nice looking little jacket to go to church in. And that was it. We had nothing warm, didn't own a sweater or a jacket or anything like that. And the convoy we were in, which was going from Honolulu to San Francisco, took a big detour to the north. There were a lot of Japanese submarines operating between Honolulu and the mainland. So we took this big loop to the north, just colder than the devil. So we spent our time wrapped up in blankets and got to San Francisco and got some warm clothes. The convoy was never attacked, thank goodness. It had 2 ships full of dependents, a couple cruisers, 2 or 3 destroyers, and that was it. And we were just not prepared for that war. We had no anti-submarine capability or any of that stuff except what the submarines could do. I would say by and large our Navy, putting aside the devastation of Pearl Harbor, was better prepared than any of the other branches of service, because Roosevelt had been a big fan of the navies, and he had seen that they had gotten some money, so they had built themselves up a little bit. Our Army was in terrible shape, small, not well trained. Marine Corps, as always, was prepared, and there were less than a division of Marines. There were about 2 regiments of Marines, and they were scattered all over the world, doing embassy duty, shipboard duty. You all have maybe heard of the famous battle on Wake Island, where a couple hundred Marines fought off the Japanese for several days, lots of Japanese, and finally got overrun and surrendered. So we were very poorly prepared for war, which was kind of inexcusable because these war clouds had been brewing in the Far East. Japan had attacked China in 1937. It was obvious they planned to go south, and we cut off their access to American oil, so they had to go to Indonesia to try and find oil. But Yamamoto, who was really the chief strategist, knew that if he didn't win this war in the first 6 months, and that's what the Battle of Midway represented, that he wasn't going to win it. That our industrial capacity was so big that we would build ships, put people in our military, and ultimately overwhelm them, which is what we did. And you all have read about the Pacific War. It was mostly the Marines, island to island, fierce battles. The Battle of Iwo Jima was the one battle in which Marines had more casualties than the Japanese, because in all those island battles, all the Japanese were killed. And in Iwo Jima, the Marines had 7,000 dead and about 14,000 wounded. And of course, they killed all the Japanese, but there were only 20-some thousand of them. So that was I went there and made a practice landing during my active duty days, and you couldn't believe that an island that was about a mile across and 3 miles long could contain up to 70,000 people fighting on it. It was just unbelievable when I walked around and saw what went on. So that's my story about Pearl Harbor.
So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.